The light on Thisavell's console had been blinking for 6 seconds before she noticed it, and by the time her trembling fingers touched the screen, the entire relay station had gone silent. It was not the normal kind of silence that came with a quiet shift on relay station Epsilon 9, the kind where the hum of machines and the soft glow of data streams made everything feel safe and distant from the rest of the galaxy. No, this was the silence of something terrible arriving without warning. The signal crashed through every communication channel at once, tearing through firewalls and encryption layers like they were made of wet paper. And Thisavell's bioluminescent wings flickered from calm blue to panicked white as her console screamed with data she did not want to read. It was a distress call. The source was the cradle of Thassan, a Valorian colony ark carrying 40,000 civilians through the uncharted corridors of deep space, and the signal was not a clean transmission. It was broken and desperate, and filled with sounds that made Thisavell's antennae curl inward against her skull. She could hear screaming. Not the screaming of adults, though that was there too, buried beneath the static, like something drowning. No. What froze Thisavell's blood was the high-pitched wailing of larvae, hundreds of them, their tiny voices crying out in the instinctive distress song that every Valorian was born knowing. And beneath the screaming, she could hear something else, a wet clicking sound, rhythmic and hungry, the unmistakable noise of Skaith mandibles at work. The Skaith raiders had found the Ark. Thisavell had read about the Skaith in training manuals, and she had seen the classified footage that all relay operators were required to watch so they would understand exactly what a Skaith distress call meant. And she had spent 3 nights unable to sleep after watching it, because the Skaith did not simply kill, they harvested. They cocooned their victims alive and dissolved them slowly over days, feeding on the biological material, while the prey remained conscious and screaming. And now they were aboard a ship carrying 40,000 of her people, including a creche of larval young who could not run, could not fight, could not do anything except cry and hope that someone heard them. Thisavell's hands moved across the console with a speed she did not know she possessed, pulling up fleet positions and calculating response times. And with every number that appeared on her screen, her wings dimmed further toward black. The nearest Galactic Concord patrol fleet was 14 standard cycles away. The Ark's shields would fail completely in 3. There was no one coming, no Concord ship, no Allied patrol, no emergency response vessel. Nothing civilized was close enough to make a difference, and Thisavell felt the weight of that truth settle on her like a stone placed on a dot. Grave, she almost closed the channel. She almost turned away and filed the report and let the system handle it the way the system always handled things, slowly, carefully, through proper channels and approved protocols, arriving just in time to document the aftermath and express official regret. But then a new sound came through the signal, a single Valorian creche keeper, her voice raw and breaking, singing the lullaby of safe return to a room full of larvae who would never see safety again. And something inside Thisavell cracked open like an egg. She pulled up the deep space scanner and searched for anything, any ship at all within range, and the screen showed her one result that made her stomach drop. The UES Tartarus, a human vessel. It sat at the edge of the quarantine buffer, that vast region of empty space the Galactic Concord had established to keep humanity contained on their side of the galaxy, far away from civilized species who could not afford to share space with the most dangerous creatures ever catalogued. Thisavell had never seen a human in person, but she knew the classification by heart, because every Concord citizen learned it in their first year of schooling. Class 12 Deathworld species, originating from a planet where the gravity crushed bones, the weather killed without warning, the oceans were filled with predators, and even the smallest life forms could inject enough poison to stop a heart. The Concorde's initial survey team had sent 40 researchers to Earth, and only 16 had come back. And none of those 16 had ever volunteered for field duty again. Humans were not allies. They were a contained threat, monitored from a distance, studied through probes and intercepted transmissions, and above all else, never ever invited across the buffer. Thisvel's supervisor, a senior Valorian named Priska, appeared behind her, with his wings flashing the sharp red of absolute. "I can see what you are thinking," he said, his voice tight with controlled fear. "And I am ordering you to close that channel and file the distress report through standard Concorde procedure." "Standard procedure will take 14 cycles," Thisvel replied, and her voice was steady, even though her wings were shaking. "The creche will be empty in 3. The humans are quarantined for a reason. The humans are the only ones close enough to help." Priska's wings went dark, which was the Valorian equivalent of going pale, and he stared at her for a long moment before turning away, not giving permission, but not stopping her either, because even he could hear the larvae screaming through the console speakers. Thisvel opened a new channel, aimed it at the Tartarus, and transmitted the distress signal along with every piece of data she had about the Ark. Its position, its shield status, the number of Scathe boarding craft attached to it, hull. And then she added something that was not part of any protocol. She added her own voice, speaking in crude human common that she had learned from intercepted entertainment broadcasts. And she said 5 words that would later be studied and debated and remembered across every corner of the galaxy. "Please, there are children aboard." She sat back and waited, her wings cycling through colors she could not control. And she expected to wait a long time, because the humans might not respond at all, because they owed the Concorde nothing, and the Concorde had given them nothing, except a cage made of empty space. The reply came in 90 seconds. It was a single line of text, transmitted in Galactic Common, so crude and simple that it barely passed through the translation filters. And it read, "We're already on our way. Hold the signal open." Thisvel stared at the screen and felt something she could not name move through her body. Hope and terror. Because the Tartarus was already moving. It had changed course before she had even sent the signal, which meant the humans had detected the distress call on their own and had already decided to respond. They had heard the screaming from across the void, and they were coming, and Thisvel did not know whether that made her want to laugh or cry or pray. So she did all 3 at once, while the signal from the dying Ark played on, and the silence of Relay Station Epsilon 9 filled with the sound of 40,000 voices, waiting to learn if they would live or die. Commander Lena Vasquez stood at the center of the Combat Information Center aboard the UES Tartarus, and watched the tactical display paint a picture that would have made most species in the galaxy surrender before the fight even started. The cradle of Thoson was enormous, a cathedral of living metal and bioluminescent tissue stretching nearly 2 kilometers from bow to stern. And it was covered in Scathe boarding craft like ticks on a dying animal, their dark hulls pulsing with the slow rhythm of a feeding swarm. 7 boarding vessels, each carrying between 40 and 60 drones, plus 1 command ship housing the brood leader and its personal guard. That put the enemy count somewhere above 300 combat-capable Scathe, each one standing over 2 meters tall, with armored carapace, razor mandibles, and stingers that could punch through standard infantry plate. Vasquez looked at this information, calculated the odds, and smiled. "All hands," she said, into the ship-wide comm, her voice carrying the particular calm that her crew had learned to recognize as the most dangerous version of their captain. "This is the commander. We have a colony ship under Scathe attack with 40,000 civilians aboard, including a creche full of babies, and we are the only ship close enough to do anything about it." She paused for exactly 1 second. "I need boarding volunteers." The response came back in under 10 seconds. Every single Marine on the ship, all 200 of them, had volunteered, and Vasquez had to spend the next 3 minutes turning people away and assigning them to support roles, because she could not take everyone and still leave enough crew to run the Tartarus. This was the part that the Galactic Concord could never understand about humans. The part that kept their xenopsychologists awake at night, writing papers that no one could agree on. It was not the strength, or the speed, or the terrifying ability to keep fighting after injuries that would kill any other species. It was this, the volunteering. 200 soldiers, every single one of them, had just raised their hands to walk into a ship full of parasitic predators, for the sake of an alien species that had helped lock them behind a quarantine line. And not one of them had hesitated. Not one had asked what was in it for them. Not one had calculated the odds and decided the risk was not worth the reward. Vasquez understood it, even if the Concord did not, because she felt it in her own bones. That ancient fire that had burned inside the human species since before they had language, since the first time one of their ancestors had heard a cry in the dark and run toward it instead of away. Humans were persistent predators, built to chase prey across entire continents until it collapsed from exhaustion. But that same relentless engine worked in reverse too. When a human decided something was theirs to protect, they would pursue that protection with the same unstoppable endurance that had once let them hunt mammoths across ice fields. And right now, 40,000 strangers had become theirs. On the other side of the void, aboard the Cradle of Thosan, brood leader Gurix was experiencing something unfamiliar. A faint signal at the edge of his awareness that his species had nearly evolved beyond the need for. A signal so ancient and unused that it took him several seconds to identify what it was. It was unease. Gurix had commanded over 40 successful harvests across Concord space, and in every single one the pattern had been the same. Breach the hull, neutralize the defenders, establish the hive core, begin processing, and wait for the Concord to arrive too late to do anything except file a report and add another entry to the growing list of atrocities they lacked the will to stop. The defenders aboard this ark had been neutralized in the first hour. Velorians were fragile creatures, beautiful and gentle, and completely incapable of mounting serious resistance against scathed combat drones. And the processing was already well underway, with hundreds of civilians sealed in enzyme cocoons along the corridors of the lower decks. Everything was proceeding exactly as it always did, except for the ship. Gurix's sensor drones had detected it 17 minutes ago, a single vessel approaching from the direction of the quarantine buffer at a velocity that the Skaith's navigation systems initially flagged as a sensor error, because nothing that size should be able to move that fast without tearing itself apart. But the ship was not tearing itself apart. It was accelerating, and it was not broadcasting any of the standard Concord approach signals. No hailing frequency, no identification burst, no demand for surrender, no warning shots across the bow, nothing at all. Just silence and speed, and Gurix found that. The silence bothered him far more than any threat would have. He queried the ship's signature against the Skaith database, and the result came back with a classification tag he had never seen in the field before. Human, Deathworld origin, threat level maximum, recommended response, immediate withdrawal. Gurix did not withdraw, because he had 300 drones, and he had never lost a harvest, and he did not believe that any single ship could threaten a force of his size, regardless of what species crewed it. He was still holding that belief when the Tartarus hit his command vessel. It was not a collision. It was a calculated strike, a ramming maneuver executed with surgical precision, at an angle that sheared the Skaith command ship open along its ventral axis, while the Tartarus's reinforced hull, built to withstand the gravitational forces and debris fields of a Class 12 Deathworld system, absorbed the impact like a fist punching through wet cardboard. The shock wave ripped through the Skaith formation, killing 40 drones instantly and sending debris spinning into the void. And before the remaining Skaith could process what had happened, the Tartarus fired its breaching pods. 12 pods, each containing a fire team of Marines in full combat armor, launched from the Tartarus's flanks and slammed into the Ark's hull at insertion speed, burning through the outer shell and delivering their cargo directly into the corridors of the besieged ship. Gurix's sensor drones locked onto the pods and began feeding him data about the creatures inside, and for the first time in his long career of harvest and slaughter, the brood leader felt the unease sharpen into something much closer to actual fear. The biosigns were wrong. Every prey species Gurix had ever encountered showed the same biological response to combat. Elevated heart rate, spiraling toward panic. Stress hormones flooding the system in a cascade of fight or flight that almost always resolved toward flight. Body temperature dropping as blood retreated from the extremities in preparation for shock. The humans showed none of this. Their heart rates were elevated, yes, but they were steady, controlled, locked into a rhythm that spoke not of panic, but of something far more unsettling. Something Gurix's instincts recognized, even if his conscious mind refused to name it. Anticipation. Their blood chemistry was a cocktail of adrenaline, dopamine, and serotonin, the chemical signature of a species that was not afraid of the coming violence, but was actively, measurably excited by it. Not in the mindless way of a berserker, but in the focused way of a predator that had spotted prey and was savoring the moment before the strike. And then the translation systems decoded the sound, coming from inside the breaching pods, and Gurix understood at last why the Concord had built a wall of empty space around. These creatures, the humans, were singing. Not screaming, not chanting, not howling. Singing, in harmony, a deep and rhythmic sound that resonated through the walls of the pods and vibrated against the hull of the Ark like a heartbeat. And the song was old, far older than their starships or their weapons or their empire. A song from the time when they had been nothing but clever animals hunting in packs across a world that was trying to kill them every single day. The pods cracked open and the singing stopped, replaced by a silence that was somehow worse. And then the first shots rang out inside the cradle of Thusan. The wolves had arrived. Sergeant First Class Tomas Reyes stepped through the breach in the hull and into a nightmare. The corridor ahead of him was wide and tall, built to accommodate the Valorian frame, delicate creatures with wingspans that needed room to flutter and stretch. And it should have been beautiful, because every surface was covered in living bioluminescent tissue that glowed in soft shades of blue and gold, like the inside of a cathedral made of light. But the light was dying. Skaith enzyme trails covered the walls in thick, dark streaks that smothered the bioluminescence wherever they touched, and the air was heavy with a smell that Reyes recognized from his training on Skaith biology. The sour, metallic stench of active dissolution, of living tissue being broken down into harvestable material. And there were cocoons. They lined the corridor like horrible fruit hanging from a vine, each one a translucent sack of enzyme gel roughly the size of a Valorian adult. Through the clouded membrane, Reyes could see shapes, bodies, curled and still, some of them with their mouths open in frozen screams, some of them with their wings pressed flat against the gel, like insects trapped in amber. Some of them were still moving. Reyes felt the anger rise in his chest like a wave of hot metal, but he did not let it take control. He channeled it, the way every Marine was trained to do, feeding it into the cold furnace of combat focus, where it would burn steady and clean instead of wild and wasteful. "Fire Team Bravo, push forward and clear left," he said through the subvocal comm embedded in his jaw, his voice barely louder than a thought. "Charlie, take right. Watch the ceiling. Skaith like to drop from above. Delta, you're on extraction. Start cutting survivors free." His team moved without a word, flowing down the corridor in pairs, with a practiced coordination that looked almost choreographed, each Marine covering their partners. Blind spots with the automatic ease of a species that had evolved to hunt in packs, and had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art. They made it 40 meters before they found the first barricade. Someone had sealed one of the side compartments from the inside, using emergency pressure doors, and the metal was scarred with the marks of scathed mandibles, where the drones had tried to cut through. But the door had held, and Reyes's helmet sensors picked up biosigns behind it. Dozens of them, small and rapid. Larvae. "Breach her up," Reyes ordered, and Private Kowalski moved to the door with her cutting torch. But Reyes stopped her with a hand signal. If they blew the door, whoever was inside would think the scathe had broken through. Instead, he pressed his helmet against the metal and spoke in Valorian, the words clumsy and thick in his mouth, because human vocal cords were never designed for the musical tones of the Valorian language. During the approach, 20 minutes of frantic practice with the ship's translation database, and he managed to say something close enough to be understood. "Friendly, we are here to help. Please open." Silence from behind the door, then a small voice, trembling and barely audible. "What are you?" "Human," Reyes said, because there was no point in lying. A longer silence, and then the door opened. Creshkeeper Iluin stood in the gap, with her wings pressed tight against her back, and her bioluminescence cycling through rapid bursts of white and violet, the Valorian colors of extreme terror. And behind her, packed into every corner of the compartment, were 200 larvae. They were small, about the size of a human fist, with translucent wings that had not yet developed their adult color, and their eyes, enormous dark pools that took up half their faces, were fixed on the doorway with the wide, unblinking stare of creatures that had been listening to monsters try to break in for hours. Iluin looked up at Reyes, and every prey species instinct in her body screamed at her to run. Because the creature standing before her was everything evolution had taught Valorians to fear. Tall, broad, forward-facing predator eyes locked onto her with a focus that felt like a physical weight. A body built of dense muscle and heavy bone that radiated raw physical power, and behind him more of the same, armored shapes moving with the fluid, silent grace of hunters on the prowl. But the creature did something unexpected. It crouched down, slowly, carefully, until its eyes were level with hers, and then it removed its helmet, revealing a face that was strange to Valorian perception, flat and expressive, with soft brown skin and dark eyes that held something Iluin had not expected to see. Kindness. "I am Sergeant Reyes," the human said in its broken, rumbling attempt at Valorian. "We are here for you. Safe now." And then it looked past her at the room full of larvae, and its expression changed in a way that Iluin would later describe to the Concord Tribunal as the most terrifying and beautiful thing she had ever witnessed. The human's jaw tightened, its eyes went bright with moisture, and it whispered something in its own language that the translator rendered simply as, "little ones." Reyes posted 2 Marines at the door, Corporal Davis and Lance Corporal Yun, and gave them one order: nothing gets through this door. They would hold that order for the next 4 hours, through 2 direct scathe assaults, until both of them were dead at their posts, with empty weapons and scathed bodies piled in front of them, like a wall built from the monsters they had killed with their last breath. But that was later. In the corridors beyond the creche, the rest of Bravo Company was learning something about the scathe that the Galactic Concord's military analysts had never been able to confirm, because no Concord species had ever engaged the scathe in direct combat and survived long enough to collect the data. The scathe were fast, strong, armored, and vicious, but they were ambush predators, evolved to strike from hiding and overwhelm prey with surprise and numbers. And when that initial advantage was taken from them, when the prey did not freeze or flee, but instead turned and charged with weapons blazing and teeth bared, the scathe did not know what to do. because nothing in their evolutionary history had prepared them for a species that got more dangerous when it was hurt. Private Hernandez took a Skaith stinger through his left thigh in the first major engagement, and instead of collapsing the way every other prey species did when pierced by Skaith venom, he looked down at the wound, said something crude and dismissive in Spanish, Field applied a tourniquet with one hand, and kept firing with the other. Caught a mandible slash across her abdomen that opened her armor and the skin beneath it, and she held her own intestines in place with her offhand, while she used her primary to put 3 rounds through the drone that had cut her. And when the medic reached her, she was still standing, still giving orders, still fighting. Corporal Chen lost his weapon in a corridor collapse, and killed the next drone that came at him with his bare hands and a broken piece of hull plating, driving the improvised blade through the gap between the Skaith's head and thorax with a precision that spoke of a predator's instinct for weak points. The Skaith had never encountered anything like this. They were used to prey that broke, that surrendered to pain and shock and the paralytic effects of venom. And these creatures did not break. They bent and cracked and bled, but they did not break. And worse than that, they adapted, learning the Skaith's patterns in real time. Tactics with every engagement. By the second hour, the Marines were not just fighting the Skaith. They were hurting them, using coordinated movements to push the drones away from civilian areas and into kill zones, where overlapping fields of fire could tear them apart in seconds. Iluin watched from the creche as a human Marine carried an armful of larvae rescued from a shattered cocoon further down the corridor, each tiny body cradled against the hard plates of combat armor with a gentleness that seemed impossible from something so large and so clearly built for violence. The Marine looked down at the larva clinging to its chest, and one of the tiny creatures, confused and afraid and running on pure instinct, pressed itself against the human's neck and began the bonding hum, the sound Valorian larvae made when they chose a protector. The Marine did not understand what was happening, but something ancient in its own biology responded. Amazement as the human's breathing slowed, its shoulders softened, and it held the larva closer. "I got you, buddy," the Marine whispered, and in that moment, Iluin understood why the Galactic Concord had built a wall around these creatures. It was not because they were dangerous. It was because they were impossible to resist. By the third hour of the boarding action, Commander Lena Vasquez had stopped receiving reports from her Marines and started receiving eulogies. Not formal ones. Marines did not have time for ceremony in the middle of a fight, but the kind that came through in short bursts over the tactical channel. Words spoken quickly between gunshots and the wet crunch of Skaith carapace giving way under human fists. "Davis and Yoon are down at the creche door." "They held it, Commander. They held it." Hernandez bled out in Corridor 7, took 4 more drones with him before he went. Medic couldn't reach him in time. Fireteam Echo is gone, all 4 of them. They drew the swarm away from a group of 60 civilians hiding in the water recycling bay. The civilians are alive. 31. That was the number that would be carved into the memorial wall aboard the Tartarus when this was over. 31 names belonging to 31 human beings who had woken up that morning with no expectation of dying, and who had chosen to die anyway. Not in retreat, not in panic, not in the blind chaos of a battle gone wrong, but deliberately, consciously, in the act of placing their bodies between alien strangers and the things that wanted to eat them. Every single one of the 31 had died facing forward. Vasquez absorbed each report with the steady, burning calm of a woman who had learned long ago that grief was a luxury a commander could not afford during combat. And she filed each name in the place behind her ribs where the cost of command was kept. And she promised each of them, silently, that their deaths would mean something. The Skaith were breaking. Of the 312 drones that had boarded the cradle of Thosan, fewer than 60 remained. and they had retreated to the engine bay at the heart of the ship, where brood leader Gurix had established his hive core, the central processing hub, where the most valuable captives were kept in deep cocoon suspension, their bodies slowly converted into the biological material the Scathe used to breed new drones. Vasquez stood in the Combat Information Center and studied the tactical display, and saw that she had a choice. She could vent the engine bay to space, open the external doors, and let the vacuum rip everything inside into the void, and it would kill every remaining Scathe in seconds, ending the battle cleanly and without risking another human life. But the display also showed biosigns in the hive core. Valorian biosigns, dozens of them, weak but present, cocooned but still alive, still capable of being saved if someone got to them in time. "Commander," her executive officer said carefully, reading the same data, "if we go in there, we will lose more people." "I know. The tactical calculus favors venting. We save the ship, we save 40,000, and we leave the ones in the hive core too. Suffocate, in vacuum, while still wrapped in cocoons they cannot break out of," Vasquez said, and her voice was not angry, just certain. "We are not doing that." She reached for her combat armor, the set she kept in the locker behind her command chair for exactly this kind of situation. And her XO watched with the resigned expression of someone who had served with Vasquez long enough to know that arguing was pointless. "I'm going in," Vasquez said. "Get me 20 volunteers." She got 40, and had to turn half of them away, again. The assault on the hive core was the worst fighting of the entire engagement, and years later, the Marines who survived it would refuse to talk about it in detail, offering only fragments that painted a picture more vivid than any full account could have managed. The engine bay was vast and dark, a cathedral of machinery and shadow, and the Scathe had transformed it into something out of a human nightmare. Cocoons arranged in precise geometric patterns, each one containing a Valorian civilian in some stage of dissolution, and the air was thick with enzyme mist that burned human skin on contact and turned every breath into a small act of pain. The remaining Scathe fought with the ferocity of a cornered swarm, which was the most dangerous kind of Scathe. They had nowhere to retreat and nothing to lose, and their biology responded by flooding their systems with combat stimulants that made them faster and stronger, and completely indifferent to self-preservation. But the humans matched them. Vasquez led from the front, because that was the kind of commander she was, and she fought with the controlled savagery of a woman who could see children on the walls, and knew that every second she spent not killing Scathe was a second those children spent dissolving. Her rifle ran dry in the first 3 minutes, and she transitioned to her sidearm without breaking stride. Ran dry, she drew the combat knife from her chest plate and kept going, because humans had been killing things with sharp edges for 200,000 years, and the muscle memory ran deeper than any training. Around her, her Marines fought the same way, adapting, improvising, refusing to stop. And the Scathe learned in those final terrible minutes what every predator species in Earth's history had learned before them, that there was nothing in the galaxy more dangerous than a human being who had decided that something behind them was worth protecting. The swarm thinned, and then broke, and then Gurix was there. The brood leader was enormous, nearly 3 meters tall, his carapace thick with the dark iridescence of a mature alpha, his mandibles stained with the fluids of species he had harvested across a dozen worlds, and he stood between Vasquez and the deepest cluster of cocoons like a dragon guarding its hoard. Vasquez faced him with her knife in one hand and a breaching charge in the other, her armor cracked and leaking, her face bloody from a gash above her left eye, her breathing ragged but steady. Gurix looked at this small, broken, bleeding creature and spoke through his translator unit, his voice a rasping buzz that the device converted into flat, toneless galactic common. "Why?" Vasquez did not answer immediately, and Gurix pressed further, because the question was genuine. He truly did not understand. These are not your kind. These are not your species. These are the ones who caged you behind the buffer. They fear you, and they imprisoned you, and they would let you rot in quarantine for 1,000 cycles before they would call you neighbor. So why do you fight for them? Why do you die for them? Vasquez looked at him, and then she looked past him at the cocoons on the wall, at the shapes inside them, the Valorian civilians who had done nothing wrong except exist in a galaxy where the strong ate the weak and the powerful looked away. And one of those shapes was small, very small, a child with wings pressed flat, and eyes closed and a heartbeat that her helmet sensors told her was fading. She looked back at Gurix. Because they were screaming, she said, and we could hear them. Gurix processed this for exactly 1.4 seconds, which was all the time Vasquez gave him before she armed the breaching charge and drove it into the gap between his thorax and abdomen, and threw herself backward over the cocooned child as the charge detonated. The explosion tore Gurix apart. It also threw Vasquez into the wall hard enough to crack 3 ribs, rupture her spleen, and dislocate her left shoulder. A long moment, with her ears ringing and her vision swimming, and the taste of copper filling her mouth, and then she rolled over and checked the cocoon she had shielded. The child inside was alive. Vasquez pressed her hand against the membrane and felt the small heartbeat flutter against her palm. And she stayed there, bleeding and broken, until her Marines reached her and began cutting the survivors free. The last scathed drone was killed at hour 4, minute 17. When it was over, the engine bay fell silent for the first time since the scathe had arrived. And in that silence, a sound rose from somewhere deep in the ship. The sound of 200 Valorian larvae, carried in the arms of blood-soaked human Marines, who had walked them through corridors of horror to bring them here, to the heart of the ship where the battle was done. The larvae were singing. It was the comfort song, the one Valorian young sang instinctively when danger passed. Cascading melody that rippled through frequencies most species could not hear, but that resonated in the chest like a second heartbeat. The Marines did not know the words and did not understand the melody, but something in the music reached through the barriers of species and language and touched something old and universal inside them, and one by one the humans began to hum along. Vasquez sat against the wall, with a dead broodleader's blood on her hands, and a Valorian child's heartbeat under her palm, and listened to her Marines, humming an alien lullaby in a room that had been a slaughterhouse minutes before. And she wept, because she was human, and humans could do that. They could kill and grieve and protect and break, all at the same time, all with the same heart. And the galaxy had no idea what to do with that. The Galactic Concorde patrol fleet arrived 14 cycles after the distress call, exactly on schedule, and found that there was nothing left for them to do. 12 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming with the polished authority of a civilization that had maintained order across 3,000 star systems for longer than humanity had possessed the wheel. And they came prepared for a rescue operation that had already been completed by the very species they had spent the last century trying to contain. The cradle of Thosan drifted in the void, with its hull scarred and breached, but its engines stable. And beside it sat the UES Tartarus, battered, dented, its forward hull crumpled from the ramming maneuver, flying a signal flag that the Concorde's translation systems identified as an old human naval tradition. It meant action completed, survivors aboard, send medical. Fleet Commander Vosrin of the Concorde's 7th Patrol Group stared at the scene through his bridge display and felt something cold settle in the pit of his stomach. Because this was worse than finding the Ark destroyed. This was evidence, visible and undeniable, that the quarantine had failed not because the humans had broken out, but because someone had let them in. And they had done what the Concorde could not. Within 6 hours, The political machinery of the Galactic Concord had activated with the frantic energy of an institution that sensed an existential threat to its own relevance. And Ambassador Prathan, a Vosic reptilian with 300 years of diplomatic experience and a reputation for making problems disappear, was dispatched to manage the situation. The tribunal was convened aboard the Concord flagship in a chamber designed to make the accused feel small, with tiered seating rising in concentric rings around a central platform, where the subject was expected to stand and answer for their actions under the combined gaze of representatives from 47 species. Commander Vasquez stood on that platform, with 3 cracked ribs bound under her uniform, her left arm in a sling, a fresh scar bisecting her left eyebrow, and an expression on her face that Ambassador Prathan would later describe in his private journal as the look of someone who has already decided that everyone in this room is irrelevant. The charges were read with the solemn gravity that the Concord reserved for its most serious offenses: unauthorized breach of the quarantine buffer, unsanctioned military engagement within Concord-protected space, reckless endangerment of a Concord-registered vessel, and, this one was new, invented specifically for this occasion, unregulated interspecies contact resulting in psychological contamination of a protected population. That last charge referred to the larvae. The Concord xenopsychology team had examined the 200 Valorian young rescued from the creche and discovered something that sent a ripple of quiet panic through every committee and subcommittee in the Concord's vast bureaucracy. The larvae had imprinted on their human rescuers. Valorian larvae formed protective bonds with the first safe presence they encountered during a trauma event, a survival mechanism as old as their species. And these 200 larvae had bonded not with Valorian adults, but with human marines. And the bond was deep and genuine, and according to every expert consulted, completely irreversible. The Concord was terrified, not of the humans themselves, though that fear was real and well documented, but of what the imprinting represented, because it confirms the hypothesis that the Concord's most cautious analysts had been warning about for decades. Human pack bonding was not limited to humans. It was contagious. Every species that spent significant time with humans began to trust them, began to rely on them, began to see them not as the terrifying Deathworld predators the Concord's classification system described, but as protectors, as allies, as family. And once that bond formed, it could not be undone by policy or propaganda or quarantine. The larva would grow up remembering human hands, human voices, human warmth, and they would tell their creche mates, and their creche mates would tell their colonies, and within a generation, the Valorian species would carry within its collective memory the knowledge that when the darkness came, it was not the Concord that answered. It was the humans. Vasquez listened to the charges with the patience of a stone, and then she spoke, and her voice was not loud, but it carried through the chamber, with the weight of someone who had earned the right to be heard in blood. "You want to know what happened," she said. "I will tell you what happened. We received a distress call from a ship carrying 40,000 civilians, including 200 children, under attack by Skaith raiders. We responded. We boarded. We fought. We won." She paused and looked around the chamber at the faces of 47 species, some of whom could not meet her eyes. 31 of my people are dead," she continued. "Every one of them died protecting your citizens, Valorian citizens, Concord citizens, members of the same civilization that drew a line through space and told us to stay on the other side. And they did it anyway, not because they were ordered to, not because they expected a reward, but because your people were in danger and mine could help." She let that settle for exactly 3 seconds. "The charges against me include unauthorized breach of the quarantine buffer. I acknowledge that I crossed the line. I would do it again. The charges include unsanctioned military engagement. I acknowledge that I engaged the scaife without Concord authorization. Circumstances I would engage them again, faster. The charges include reckless endangerment of a Concord vessel. I would argue that the scaife endangered that vessel and I unendangered it. But I understand that my grammar may be imprecise. A small sound moved through the chamber that might have been laughter if the situation had been less grave. But the last charge, Vasquez said, and now her voice dropped lower and harder. The charge of psychological contamination. You are telling me that the crime I committed was allowing alien children to feel safe in the arms of my soldiers. You are telling me that the damage I caused was letting frightened babies bond with the people who saved their lives. You are telling me that the most dangerous thing I did was not the ramming or the boarding or the killing, but the kindness. She looked directly at Ambassador Prathan. If that is your position, Ambassador, then I think the galaxy should know exactly what kind of government it lives under, one that considers compassion a contaminant. The chamber was silent. Prathan opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, every communication screen in the chamber lit up simultaneously with an incoming broadcast on open Concord channels. All of them, every frequency, every relay, every station from the core worlds to the frontier. It was Crashkeeper Elune. She had accessed the Ark's communication array, which the Concord had not yet thought to lock down, because no one had imagined that a traumatized Valorian Crashkeeper would have the audacity to do what she was doing. And she was broadcasting to the entire galaxy. Her voice was small and musical and shaking with emotion, and she spoke in Galactic Common so that every species could understand. My name is Elune. I am a Crashkeeper aboard the Cradle of Thosan. 14 cycles ago, my ship was attacked by Scathe raiders, and 40,000 of my people, including 200 larvae in my care, faced harvest and death. The Galactic Concord was 14 cycles away. They are always 14 cycles away. She paused, and when she continued, her bioluminescence was burning gold, the Valorian color of absolute truth. The humans came. They came without being asked, without hesitation, without demanding payment or alliance, or the lifting of the quarantine that your government placed upon them. They came because they heard us screaming, and that was enough. They fought the Scathe in our corridors, and they bled on our floors, and 31 of them died so that we could live. And I watched a human soldier hold my larva against its chest, and sing to them in a language they could not understand. And my children chose that soldier as their protector, because even the youngest and most helpless among us could feel what the Concord refuses to admit. That these creatures are not the monsters you told us they were. They came for us. They bled for us. They sang to our children. If this is what a Deathworlder is, then we have been fearing the wrong monsters. The broadcast ended, and the silence that followed was the loudest sound Vasquez had ever heard. Across Concord space, on relay stations and colony worlds and orbital platforms and ships of every size and species, billions of beings heard that message and looked at each other and began to ask the question that the Concord had spent a century trying to prevent. What if we have been wrong about the humans? On relay station Epsilon 9, Thisvel sat at her console and wept as the broadcast played, her wings cycling through every color she possessed, and she watched as, one by one, then in dozens, then in hundreds, communication channels began opening across the quarantine buffer, unofficial and unauthorized, sent by species and colonies and individuals who had heard Eluan's words and made a decision. The Tartarus picked up the signals as it limped back toward human space, its hull battered and its crew exhausted, and its medical bay full of wounded Marines who would carry scars for the rest of their lives. Vasquez stood on the bridge and watched the incoming transmissions scroll across her screen. Messages from species she had never heard of, from worlds she could not pronounce, from governments and villages and single frightened beings on the other side of a line that was already beginning to dissolve. And every message said the same thing in 100 different languages. Please help us. We heard what you did. Vasquez looked at her crew, her wounded, grieving, exhausted crew, who had given everything they had and lost 31 of their own, and who by every reasonable measure had earned the right to go home and rest and mourn. She knew what she should do. She also knew what she was going to do. She opened the ship-wide comm, and her voice reached every corner of the Tartarus, from the bridge to the engine room to the medical bay, where bandaged Marines lifted their heads to listen. All hands, new tasking, we have people who need us. The Tartarus changed course, and across the galaxy, in the halls of the Concord and the homes of 1,000 species, and the quiet spaces where fear had lived for 100 years, something shifted. Not with the roar of revolution, but with the soft, steady sound of doors opening, one by one, toward a species that had never stopped knocking. Not because they wanted in, but because they could hear someone crying on the other side.